Hi, welcome to In Focus. I'm Karen Moore here at Rivers headquarters in New York, and I'm in a very red room. I'm in one of our lovely conference rooms here on the 28th floor. And today we're going to be talking about racism as a public health crisis. We're joined by Dean Michelle Williams of Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dean Williams, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Karen. Great to be with you, and please feel free to call me Michelle.
Well, Michelle, I went to Catholic school for a very long time, so I just revere academicians. So, Michelle, we have so much ground to cover, so let's dive in. So, racism as a public health crisis. I immediately think about COVID, and I guess that's probably a really good place to start. A disease that's disproportionately affected poor people, Black and brown people. Is that really a good place to start?
Yes, it absolutely is a great place to start. But we could have easily also have started at another crisis. Let's say, for example, Hurricane Katrina several years ago. Why COVID is probably the best place to start is because we are living through this right now. And because COVID, this pandemic, unlike, let's say, Hurricane Katrina, is a more enduring, longer lasting. We're in 14 months of this crisis, this pandemic. But I will say that what COVID has done for us in keeping our gaze for 14 months on the structural inequalities and racism among them that has led to the disproportionate burden that this pandemic has borne out on Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. So we might ask ourselves, why this disproportionate burden? And the factors that contribute to the vulnerability of these populations are decades, if not century in the making. Decades and century-long policies and practices that have contributed to this disparity in outcomes. And I mean, racist policies, going back to the history of slavery, where Black and brown bodies were traumatized. What does this mean in reality? Well, when you think about the lack of opportunity for Black Americans, for example, to accrue wealth and retain wealth, which is the basic substance that you would need for supporting the determinants of health, housing, food security, access to quality medical care, education, broadband, all of these commodities that are supported to the fundamental building of health and resilience to shocks like a pandemic or a hurricane have been routinely deprived because of structural racist policies and practices from Black and brown communities. And because of that, there's been a higher level of comorbid medical conditions in populations. So when a pandemic, when a virus that challenges the respiratory health of people is overlaid on already higher proportions of asthma and diabetes and obesity because of the lack of structural supports, access to care, food, housing, you would see a higher rate of acquisition of the virus, higher rates of severe infections, higher rates of mortality. And we have to really reckon with the fact that racist policies, racism, contributed to this vulnerability and lack of capacity to be resilient in the face of a threat. I also want to distinguish the fact that there is systematic racism and then there is everyday discrimination. And everyday discrimination, like systematic racism, contributes to a wear and tear on the body. And my colleague, David Williams, has spoken very much about how the stress of discrimination, the stress of stigmatization of an entire group of people contributes biologically to a vulnerability towards environmental stressors that arise. So it's very important to see this as a learning opportunity that racism contributes to public health crisis. It robs populations of being responsive. And it also, I think, robs all of us from having the resilience economies, society needs to respond to threats.
And do you talking about the United States? Does this play out around the world. I know that we've reported here, for example, at Bloomberg, that out of 1 billion people in Africa, only around 5 million have received the vaccine. Is this playing out, this racism as a public health crisis? Is it playing out in other parts of the world as well?
It is racism, but also incredible inequity is contributing to a disproportionate distribution of the public health tools like vaccines that would be brought forward in places like Africa, like South America. Brazil is struggling right now with a massive surge, India as well. And the disproportionate distribution of the resources to acquire the vaccines, and then the underdevelopment of the workforce necessary to turn the vaccines into vaccinations, shot into arms, contribute to the lack of resiliency. Some of this will be geopolitical discrimination, some of it racist, but some of it an lack of attention to the disproportional distribution of resources in securing and improving the health of all.
Okay, so we've talked about hurricane, which is a natural disaster, and disease, which is a natural disaster. What about man-made events that have health outcomes? And I'm thinking about environmental racism, for example. Can you talk about how that might factor in?
Yeah. Racism manifests in so many different ways, but one of the most pernicious ones, I think, would be environmental racism. And you can point to several historical practices and policies that contribute to environmental racism. And I'll use redlining, which was, a policy set in place some 50, 60 years ago. And redlining, allowed for the deprivation of appropriate resources and building up of facilities and living spaces that would secure and enable Black communities, for example, for having a physical environment that was supportive of health and wellness. So we saw, paving over of green spaces that today now manifest as that pavement, that concrete space, lack of green space, manifests now in the context of climate change as a health threat because of the extremely high temperatures that can occur given the changes in our climate. Redlining contributed to the lack of resources coming into Black communities in Indianapolis, for example, where redlining allowed for investments in northern parts of the city where waste plants were moved into poorer Black neighborhoods, which decreased the property value of those neighborhoods, which led to underinvestment in education because property value gives tax revenue that supports education. And so you can see how an environmental policy leading to deprivation of a tax base led to a disadvantaged education system. One last thing I'll say, there is an injustice right now unfolding right here in the United States in not having equitable access to sanitation. Catherine Flowers recently wrote a book, and it's called Waste. And this book describes her personal journey in trying to close the gap in access to sanitation policies that would support and enable poor rural communities in the South of having the resources, the capacity, and even laws changed that disproportionately penalize poor populations that have underdeveloped sewage systems in communities. Environmental justice manifests in many different ways, but all of them have an important impact on the health of populations living in communities.
And I know that you also have some thoughts as well about policing here in the United States. Can you talk with us about that as well?
It's not lost on anyone that as we were struggling with the pandemic that we all witnessed the worst example of policing in the murder of George Floyd. But what that one incident illustrates is decades long, if not century long, harmful policies and practices in policing and criminal justice that has disproportionately harmed Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations. We are struggling with several crises that we could recognize and call a public health crisis that has its roots in racism. The criminal justice system, as it is currently executed, disproportionately harms poor families, families with mental illness, families that have a member in the family who is in the criminal justice system. It is a multi-generational problem that there has to be ways to evaluate and appreciate how policing reform can be reimagined and implemented in ways that support and enable communities to thrive, not bring about the violence that we have seen all too often played out on the bodies of Black and Brown and Native Americans in this country. I'm heartened by the fact that more people are talking about this, Karen, and that there are legislators and community activists and academics all grappling with how can we reimagine a criminal justice system that protects and serves, emphasis on serves, society.
And what is the research that perhaps is coming out of your institution or other institutions that you follow and respect? What seem to be, in your opinion, to be the most fruitful reforms that are being put forth?
Well, I think there are many. There are legislative reforms that are coming forward, but I also think there is a call for taking a serious look at what diversity and inclusion and belonging means in all sectors of society, in the corporate sector, in the governance and civil service, and in the academic sector. We at Harvard just announced a new head of our university police department, and I'm impressed with the statement and the narrative of this new police leader of law enforcement for our university campus, because he brings forward the fact that policing is at its best when those officers are members of the community that they're serving. It's as simple as that. If we can have a greater, more holistic, diverse, and well-trained force, we would have a realization of the protect and serve as opposed to this aggressive, hostile episodes that we have seen happen. So I think there's training that needs to be done. We need to pay attention to having a diverse workforce across all sectors, but especially in law enforcement. And there has to be a real reimagining, because there's some activities that law enforcement is now having responsibility for that really should be provided by other health professionals, such as social workers, and a better equipped and prepared mental health workforce.
I want to talk about that because mental health is something that is certainly part of the problem, and the suggestion that police officers are being called upon to do so many different things, and part of that is being mental health professionals, but they are not mental health professionals at a time when the mental health crisis is only going to get worse, is only going to expand thanks to COVID. There's just going to be more need in the months ahead. Where do we even go to start addressing those problems? I mean, do we have enough mental health professionals? Are our communities staffed appropriately? Are there enough people to go around? Is there enough money to go around?
Karen, those are all so fundamentally important questions. And, maybe one of the collateral benefits of COVID, if we might even think about that, is
Mhm.
that these problems, these issues they've bubbled up to the surface so that more of our community, our society are grappling with these questions. I want to point out that this concern about the burden of mental illness and mental health challenges pre-existed COVID. But COVID really, made it much more clear that we have been underestimating and undervaluing the importance of addressing the issues of high levels of anxiety, depression, and trauma that has been experienced across the board. Before COVID, we were struggling with a mental health crisis within the healthcare profession. The levels of burnout were reaching alarming levels where we were having health providers, clinicians, nurses exiting the healthcare workforce. And then COVID hits. And that challenge with a workforce that's already been, strained and robbed of resiliency was pushed to the front lines to help us manage clinically, but also epidemiologically, this unknown pathogen. I hope that what comes from this harsh experience that we've all embodied over the last 14 months is a greater understanding that we as a society have to do three things. We have to recognize that mental health is important, and you can't have health without understanding mental health, and physical health goes hand to hand. Secondly, we have to recognize that we must destigmatize mental illness. We must understand and bring compassion and bring real thought, leadership, and skills to helping individuals, families, and communities struggle and manage appropriately the burden of mental illness that is expressed all across the life course, every age group. And third, our young people are exquisitely exposed and vulnerable to the impacts that this pandemic has had on their learning and their development and their isolation, social isolation from their teachers, their peers, their extended family members. And we have to be mindful that this developing population of young people and adolescents, their needs for mental health support is going to outlast the clinical and epidemiological risks of the pandemic. And we have to have systems and practices in place to help them re-engage and re-onboard into the living and learning and playful spaces that they will be able to occupy once we work our way out of the pandemic. So bottom line is we have to see, we have to recognize, and we have to bring responsible and responsive practices, legislation, and an ecosystem that supports mental health wellness.
So whose responsibility is that as school children theoretically start, and I'm so glad you brought up young people, because I think that sometimes when perhaps in some communities, people hear mental health and they think, maybe teens and up, but we're talking about younger children here as well. We're talking about the entirety of our population. But as children everyone starts getting back to normal. We're going back to school, we're going back to university, we're going back to work. Whose job is it to talk about mental health, and who regulates that? Who tells schools, even kindergartens, to pay attention to the mental health of their students, of their pupils?
That's a great question, and I'm going to say it has to be all of us, but primary responsibility has to rest with our public health leadership community. And it's why I am so delighted that the Biden-Harris administration, are advancing policies and practices that will enable the refunding of a public health infrastructure that will allow for the appropriate execution of better public health practices that will account for risk surveillance and risk mitigation and management. And specifically, what I mean here is the commitment to expand the public health workforce, to train and enable them and empower them to address the needs mental health needs, physical health needs, environmental health needs, all those social determinants that are the big drivers of 80% of our wellness. We need a better public health workforce that's the position to do this, because we have to connect the dots across all of these different sectors that we've been talking about. We have to be able to have a public health workforce and a public health infrastructure that helps us make sure that those social determinants that support mental health as well as physical health, housing security, food security, access to medical health care, living wage, education, all of those, when put together and managed, connecting those dots, will allow us to have a better opportunity to build a healthy population, and especially pay attention to the needs of the most vulnerable. I also think, Karen, that communication, the kinds of conversations we're having now, increases awareness, because the responsibility rests with all of us, the individual, the family, the community, the nation. Public health is not something that is a one and done. It requires individual accountability, community accountability, as well as a local, federal governance that provides coherent messaging and resources, skills, and guidelines for us to improve health, mitigate risks, and position us for thriving.
I mean, it's a ton of work. I mean, this is a heavy lift. I mean, it's a huge amount of education to be done at every possible level. I know that your school public health is involved with 90 to 0, which I do want you to explain what that organization does, and that's a lot of collaboration. Well, why don't you explain what 90 to 0 does, and why you're involved with it, and why you think that's part of the solution?
Yeah, perfect. It is a heavy lift, Karen. It is overwhelming to think about how many different inputs, right, have an impact on individual and population health. It is indeed a heavy lift, and it's why it's so important that collaborations across all sectors, a strong, well-educated population, and a robust and resilient workforce is needed all the time, not just during shocks like a pandemic or a Hurricane Katrina, but all the time, because it is a heavy lift. But if we do it well, and if we invest in a workforce and an infrastructure to support human thriving, it works beautifully. So 90 to 0 is an incredibly important response to all of the challenges and issues that we've started talking about, Karen. 90% of Black households in this country have zero wealth. We would like to turn that statistic into 0% of households, Black households in America, have zero wealth. And to do that, we have to be very intentional and very deliberate as to why we need to do this. Why we need to do this is because of the 401-year history of the deprivation of Black people in this country to, as a population, secure and retain the capacity to have wealth. This is in being properly compensated for the labor, to be not victims of land use policies that have deprived holding and retaining land. This is a way to correct the structural racism that has deprived a whole population from having the wealth that is needed as a first step towards building healthy resilience. I'm really proud of this work that is co-led and actually founded by Wes Moore, because he is someone who gets that it's a heavy lift. He is someone who understands how multi-generational impacts of structural racism can lead to the vulnerabilities that we're seeing played out today. He is the one who also, I think, like all of the partners, the partners from corporate America, the partners from academia, the dean of the Wharton School of Business, Erica James is a member of this group, understand that it's going to take all of us. It's going to take the private sector. It's going to take the academy, academicians across all disciplines. It's going to take our corporate leaders who understand and see that they have a role to play. And it will take governance. It will take leadership. So we need a 90-0 to undo what took 4 centuries to create this legacy of disparities. And we can do this by being really smart about repositioning financial assets into communities that have been left behind, and allow these communities, support these communities to build the capacity to generate wealth in Black communities, Brown communities, and Native Americans. And it starts with strategic, thoughtful, careful investments that we will all have to make and manage to grow labor force, to grow and improve educational processes, and to begin to bring these communities that have been left behind into the economic enterprise. If we do that, as a public health person, I will tell you it will have an incredibly exponential set of co-benefits that are not only driving health and wealth, but is also creating a multi-generational pathway for improving and correcting the legacies of racism in this country.
And you also think that PTA has a role in this as well, in terms of representation and the things that people in my profession can do. Can you share what you think on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think this last year has given us a real opportunity to understand that we have to work together with our journalists, colleagues, and friends. We have to be better in improving and reporting on life sciences, health sciences. And we have to do this in a way that reaches all of the varied populations that have to have the news. There's a structural flaw in how we, in public health, message health risks, health challenges, and interventions. We start by communicating to the middle class, and it's only later do we get to the at-risk vulnerable populations. Our friends in the media have brought that forward to us, and we have to figure out how to get the message out in real time to the most vulnerable population, but also how to keep everyone engaged in understanding that we all collectively have a role to play. I'll tell you the other thing. My friends in the media, you all are doing something critically important that we hadn't done before. You've started to make the economic case for why paying attention to diversity and inclusion has a value, a moral value, but also an economic value to all of us. So, I'm thinking to the reporting that's been done about the Citi report that said, we as a society, as a US country, suffered a $16 trillion loss because of our inattention to closing the disparities gap in dealing with racism. And their same analysis reported that we would, if we started to address racial inequality in this country, could regain in 5 years a third of that GDP that's lost. Reporting broadly these financial arguments, building the case, and telling that story broadly outside of academic spaces, but across all sectors of society, is fundamental, I think, for our turning around the complacency that we've had, quite honestly, before we've all had to grapple with the economic, social, and racial crisis that COVID has sort of, brought forward.
The half hour has gone by so quickly. What does give me some hope is that we can learn some things. We no longer go on a picnic and leave our trash about, generally speaking. We have learned that garbage is generally speaking bad, that we shouldn't, that pollution is bad. We have learned that. Companies have learned that. We've learned that smaller packaging is good. And we can differ on how we're going to get there and who's going to pay for what. But generally speaking, we've learned some things about thinking about how humans can live with the environment and being more mindful and being more careful. Our moonshot with COVID has been, we wash our hands. We've actually learned that. If nothing else, we've learned how to wash our hands. Is there another moonshot coming out of COVID? Is there something that we actually can take away from this that is helpful, that's going to push us forward?
I think our moonshot out of this, there are going to be many moonshots that will come out of this, but I think one of the most important ones is that we are all playing an important role collectively in the health and wellness of our society. And where I think we need to double down our efforts is in educating everyone, in appreciating the importance of public health. I think a best moonshot, and I'm biased, I've spent my whole life in the academy, I am a teacher, but I think as we grapple with just how to report risks and risk mitigation practices like mask wearing and vaccination, that if we can transform our educational system so everyone has some fundamental understanding of public health, we will be better, stronger, more resilient.
Right, this will be the last word. Dean Williams, thank you so much. Dean Williams, head of Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Next week, we're going to focus on women as we slip towards Mother's Day here in the United States. For those of us who have relatives in other places, we know that we've had Mother's Day already. Dee Poku Spalding will be joining us. She's the founder of the We Suite. It's a community of women leaders and creators who use their collective influence and expertise to advance and succeed. She's been doing some interesting work with founders, women, Black and Brown founders, and Latinx founders. So that's going to be a great conversation for next week. Again, Michelle, we're now friends. I'm going to call you when I need some inspiration. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great conversation. To everyone else, thank you so much. I'm Karen Toulon for Black in Focus, and this is Bloomberg.